To celebrate Halloween, the official Disney fan club D23 recently had a live stream and virtual costume contest hosted by none other than the drag queen Nina West. For those unfamiliar with West's work outside of the reality TV show RuPaul's Drag Race, this might seem like an unexpected collaboration, but that's not necessarily the case. Nina West has been very vocal about how much she loves Disney throughout her career. In fact, on the season 11 live tour for Drag Race, she even performed in a segment called I Really Fucking Love Disney, in which she cycled through songs from various Disney films, throwing off multiple layers of outfits to reveal which song she would lip sync to next. Even before she was on Drag Race, she had a pretty extravagant Mary Poppins medley as well. So it's clear that Nina West hosting a Disney livestream actually makes a lot of sense. However, it also shows a distinct progression on the part of Disney. As you know if you're a fan of this channel, Disney has a complicated relationship with the LGBTQ community. Despite having a lot of queer coding within their catalog and even out LGBTQ employees influencing their art in the past few decades, the company's conservative public image and legacy has somewhat limited the stories they've told. This has been slowly changing since the 90s, and especially in the last 10 years, making the direct collaboration with Nina West another step forward in acknowledging their relationship to the LGBTQ community in their media. However, Disney's relationship to drag didn't start with Nina West. As I've spoken about before, Disney songs have often followed traditions that have both intentionally and unintentionally linked them with the LGBTQ community, resulting in a large queer fan base and also many queer people first learning to express themselves through Disney characters. So let's talk about Disney and drag.
Fun to be free, to be on the move, to go for a hike or whatever you like to do. Do all there is to be done. It's fun, it's fun, it's fun to be free, fun to be free.
As I highlighted in my videos on Ferdinand the Bull and the Reluctant Dragon, early Disney films frequently utilized something called queercoding. However, Disney wasn't the only company to use it. The history behind queercoding is actually quite nuanced, and is the result of a general trend in early Hollywood films of the time. However, I won't be the only one to tell you that. To learn more about the history of queercoding, let's see what queer theorist and fellow YouTuber Rowan Ellis thinks.
You can only see this little bit here, I've realised, but it is actually a shirt of Mickey Mouse playing the guitar, which felt pretty appropriate. So let's talk about the Hays Code. So there was this court case in 1915 that was very catchily named, see if I can remember, the Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. Bit of a mouthful, but very important. What's important about this case is actually the verdict. The Supreme Court basically laid down that because film could be used for evil, they couldn't allow it to be completely outside the control of government. It essentially was looking at whether film would be protected under First Amendment rights or not. And when that decision was made, Hollywood and filmmakers realised, oh, the government could definitely impose their own censorship laws onto us. And so they did it before the government could. This code that they created for themselves became the Motion Picture Production Code, or more commonly, the Hays Code. The code was in place in some way or another from the 30s all the way through to the 60s, which was a quintessential time in film history, and a lot of ideas around the language and the culture of film come from that time. Or they come from people making films after that who were extremely influenced by the films of that time. And so a lot of ideas that were put into films then have kind of carried through to now, even if people don't realise that that's where they came from. Now, because the code was self-imposed, it wasn't illegal to not follow the code, but if you wanted to get funding, if you wanted to get distribution, if you wanted your film to get picked up, you would follow it. This code has some really interesting stipulations, especially when it came to things like violence or sex or crime. The code followed a ton of ideas around morality at the time, but the one that is most relevant to us is this. The sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. So because of the code, if you were a director or writer at the time, then you couldn't be seen to be on the side of people doing wrong or evil or sinful things. And so on a practical level, what that meant is that if you did show characters doing those things or hinting that they did those things, they would have to be punished or be seen to be living miserable and incomplete lives because of it, or in a lot of cases, including with queer characters, not really be seen openly at all. Disney itself, unsurprisingly, adhered to this. Probably the most famous example is their portrayal of the Wind in the Willows Toad of Toad Hall character in Ichabod Crane and Mr. Toad. In the original book, there's this whole storyline about the fact that Mr. Toad steals a motor car, But because you can have your protagonist be seen to be a criminal stealing a car, the film changes it around completely to be that he was framed, and the entire thing revolves around trying to prove his innocence. So how does this fit in with LGBTQ+ representation in Disney? Well, as I've already mentioned, being LGBTQ+ would have been seen as being under the wrongdoing, evil and sin, and so wouldn't be able to be portrayed openly. However, there were films that would portray stereotypical aspects of queer people in order to either hint at that character being queer or to hint at that character being villainous, because they had the attributes of someone who, at the time, was viewed to be an inherently bad person. It's essentially a negative feedback loop. You have a society that views queer people and stereotypical queer behaviours as being immoral or evil, and so filmmakers use those as shorthand for villainy or evil characters in their films. And then people watch those films and associate queer people and queer behaviours with villainy, and so it continues. Stereotypes in male queer coding might include things like being flamboyant, feminine, prim, talking with a lisp, or being vain or wanton in their movements. And here's the thing, I don't think that the people who made those films are like inherently homophobic for having done that. What I think is that they probably just don't know why they've done it. They see these attributes that are traditionally given to villainous characters, and so when they're writing a villain, they think, oh, well, this is what a villain does, this is what a villain looks like or acts like. In the very hetero and cis-normative world of Disney movies, as well as, you know, society in general, it makes sense to have villains act like this or look like this, because you're trying to contrast them with your hero character, who is going to be traditionally masculine. If our protagonist is the good guy hero we're meant to root for, then it kind of makes sense to make the villain the opposite of that. And so queer-coded villains are often linked to deviating from gender norms. Now in real life, these attributes are not exclusive to queer people, and similarly not all queer people have these attributes. And it doesn't mean that the characters themselves are queer, but they are all characteristics that are historically and in the modern times still associated with queer people. And so in this way, you can have a character who ostensibly seems to be heterosexual on screen, but brings together these queer-coded attributes and villainy to still contribute to the trope. Some classic examples are Jafar with his shoulder pads, eyeliner and general snark, Scar with his effeminate and feline body language, Ratcliffe, who is vain, wears bows in his hair, is obsessed with golden glitter, hates masculine physical labour and dotes on his tiny prim dog. Hades is quite literally flaming, with a girly cocktail drink, hand movements and sassiness. King Candy from Wreck-It Ralph is flamboyant, has a pronounced lisp, bright pink decor in his castle, and is labelled by a hero as a Nelly wafer, employing a gay insult. And of course we have Ursula. Based on the famous drag queen Divine, she is vain and sexual with a husky voice and exaggerated makeup.
One of the interesting things about queer coding in Disney is that there is surviving evidence that certain things were intentional. For example, regarding the Reluctant Dragon, Ward Kimball is credited with saying that it was quote-unquote probably the first gay character that the studio had ever done. Now, at no point is the dragon's sexuality referenced, nor is sexuality even a part of the story. But the ways in which the dragon is queer coded are stark. The pansy stereotype, the effeminate inflection, being portrayed by an actor also known for portraying other queer coded characters, the list goes on. If you want to watch a more in-depth video about that, I'll be linking to my video about the Reluctant Dragon in the description. Like Rowan mentioned, another classic example of intentional queer coding within the Disney catalog is the character Ursula from The Little Mermaid. Basically, animator Rob Minkoff drew a draft of the evil sea witch that people from the studio agreed looked a lot like the drag queen Divine. Given the fact that lyricist Howard Ashman was a gay man who is reportedly a fan of Divine and John Waters, this likely influenced the character's development. For many people, drag represents an exploration of gender expression, allowing people to comment on the flexibility of gender through performance. This interpretation of drag puts it outside of what mainstream outlets such as RuPaul's Drag Race make it seem like. Drag is less about gender impersonation and more about gender exploration. Ursula from The Little Mermaid is a good example of this for a few reasons. Not only was she based off of a drag queen, but she was even played by a drag queen in the Latin American Spanish dub of the movie. Credited under the drag name of Serena Olvido, this bit of queer representation feels fitting. However, the gender-bending nature of Ursula as a character didn't end with Serena Olvido. In the Arabic dub of the movie, Ashraf Swaylem did the singing voice for Ursula. Though he isn't a drag queen, there is something to be said about a man voicing a woman character in a Disney film that definitely adds to the queer coding. The same could be said for Harvey Fierstein voicing Ursula out of drag at one of the Hollywood Bowl Little Mermaid concerts. But Fierstein's queerness and relationship to drag plays a more integral role in understanding his performances. Possibly the most drag queen-esque aspect of Ursula is her song Poor Unfortunate Souls that really takes a magnifying glass to aspects of camp. In other words, there's a sort of extravagant, borderline tacky type of performance that has roots both in musical theater and in LGBTQ culture. For example, the gaudy portrayal of the character and the androgynous performance by Pat Carroll plays directly into the queer coding. In addition to this, Alan Menken has mentioned before that the music for Poor Unfortunate Souls was influenced by Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera. Given how similar Poor Unfortunate Souls and Pirate Jenny are, this checks out. This relates to the LGBTQ community because not only did Brecht and Weill's music represent the counterculture of the 1920s/early 30s in Germany, but Weimar cabaret also played a role in queer aesthetics at the time. The importance of the queer coding plays out in the music, and I would say it has definitely influenced how drag performers relate to Disney. I think the amount of drag performers featuring Poor Unfortunate Souls more than speaks to the staying power of it in LGBTQ culture. Similarly, another one of the most parodied Disney properties in drag culture, Hocus Pocus, also has characters who are thought of as resembling drag queens, specifically by the film's director. This is what makes me so interested in this link between Disney and drag. Sure, there are a lot of people who dress up in drag as Disney characters, but the popularity of Disney songs and the popularity of lip syncing within drag performance has linked Disney and drag in a unique way. According to the drag performer Cucci Binaca, music has the ability to center yet transport its listeners. In the art of drag, music is the spine that holds the body of performances together. Music is what centers me on an idea to transport people through the pits of despair and the sharp peaks of camp. For many people, lip syncing is the first setting in which they experience drag performers due to the tendency of drag performances to be held at clubs where music is the primary form of entertainment. The history of this can be traced back to vaudeville performance and other types of musical theater-esque performance where the focus was on melodrama and entertaining the audience regardless of what the music was about. If you've watched my videos before, you'd know that Disney music also grew out of a similar space. Due to the prominence of LGBTQ people in musical theater of the late 1800s and early 1900s, this also led to many aspects of the art form being explicitly and implicitly associated with the LGBTQ community. If you want to learn the full detailed history of that, I'll link to my video on it in the description. But right now it's just important to know that both drag and Disney songs relate to the tradition of musical theater, which historically has played a particular role in LGBTQ culture. Due to the historical link between early operetta, musical theater, and countercultural movements, it became safer for LGBTQ people to occupy those spaces. This presence was magnified by the ways in which queer people could explore gender expression through the art form. What we now know as drag also began forming around the same time that musical theater did, often as a part of vaudeville and other associated performance styles. But it would still be some time before recorded music was even commercially available, let alone popularized in the same way that lip syncing is in modern drag communities. In a Slate article, drag historian Joe E. Jeffries said that the link between drag and lip syncing came from the homes of aspiring drag performers. They got together, dropped a needle on the phonograph, and someone did "I'm Just a Girl Who Can't Say No," and then someone else said, "Oh girl, you're a camp. You gotta do that down at the bar." In the same article, anthropologist Esther Newton also referenced this type of performance making its way to clubs in 1960s Chicago. As portable record players became more accessible, people would start bringing them to clubs and incorporating numbers into their performances. This was also at a time when musical theater and drag were both developed art forms with similar roots, so the association was natural. They both relied on elements of camp, and as a result were also important tools for queer expression. For performers like Nina West, linking drag and Disney is very intuitive. Disney movies feature iconic female protagonists that fall easily into the hands of drag culture. However, other performers such as Yvie Oddly were influenced by Disney in a different way. If we're going to boil ourselves down to trite inspirations, then yes, a lot of my visual inspirations have always been villains. Disney villains, supervillains. Character-wise, they're more colorful and interesting. There's always been something fun about tapping into that taboo, because it's a naturally human experience. In that quote, I think Oddly brings up a very important point with regards to the longevity of Disney in queer communities. Though there are instances where the queer coding was deliberately linked and celebrated by the community, a lot of the characters that people love are A, unintentionally or not explicitly queer, and B, villains. Ursula and the witches from Hocus Pocus being mainstays in the drag community makes sense, but what about Maleficent, a character who was not explicitly queer-coded in that way, but who is also frequently referenced by drag artists? Drag performers and contests have also regularly appeared at unofficial Disney events such as Gay Days, with performers often interpreting Disney characters into drag looks and musical performances. Other drag artists such as Adriana Sparkle and Miss Disney have incorporated Disney aesthetics outside of the traditionally drag-aligned ones into their art. King Phantom and Jay Crimson have also explored the drag possibilities behind male Disney villains. If you haven't seen Jay Crimson's take on Be Prepared from The Lion King, you absolutely should. It's a real treat. There have also been drag performers who might not be emulating Disney, but clearly have a definition of Disney that informs the way they do drag. For instance, the drag group Denim references Disney in a particular way. We use pop music as a vehicle to smuggle in our politics. Our visuals are intentionally quote-unquote Disney and quote-unquote sweet, so once the audience feels like it has a place in our show, that's when we hit them with the political material, like my being a queer Muslim or supporting queer sex positivity.
As I pointed out earlier, the aesthetics of Disney villains are literally rooted in queerness. There is this kind of delicious campiness in the exaggerated qualities of cartoons in general, and Disney is like the prime source material for that. If we see drag in a lot of cases as being a conversation between masculine, feminine, gender binary androgyny, then what better to include, incorporate and critique within drag than the epitome of very gendered fairy tales that is Disney. When you watch one of Nina West's performances of I Really Fucking Love Disney, it's not just a performer utilising songs that they are a fan of. The reaction of the crowd around her is electric. People screaming in joy just from the opening notes of A Circle of Life. I think it's pretty safe to say that there is a crossover of queer fans of drag and queer fans of Disney. Disney is undeniably a cultural musical touchstone, something that can be pastiched or camped up or interpreted for an audience with a sense of collective understanding. And West's performance is always twisting the original songs, giving a kind of nudge and a wink flavour to the lyrics. Grabbing her breasts and crotch to I'll Make a Man Out of You, miming throwing her back out to Then Somebody Bends Unexpectedly, or leaning into the implication of small to say the least in Tale as Old as Time. Drag cosplayer Tom Cat has also talked about the idea that growing up with strong female role models meant that he often associated more with the female villains than he did with the princesses and heroines. Unlike West's high energy performance, which often utilises simple silhouettes or colour schemes to evoke a certain character, Tom Cat is more interested in a kind of screen-accurate portrayal, which is based very much in cosplay. The appeal of cosplaying the outsider characters within Disney is coupled with his idea that cosplay is very important to anyone who has been ostracised, in the way that it allows people to build themselves up, find confidence, or play with their identity without pressure. In recent years, there's been this really interesting kind of trend of acceptance by Disney of these Disney drag queens, especially when it comes to the marketing and promotion of their brand. Nina West in particular has had paid sponsored opportunities with Disney, creating a video of a Maleficent makeup look, and also been invited onto the red carpet. And although we can see this as a kind of progressive acceptance by Disney, I think it's much more likely to be linked to the marketing aspect. The fact that they're really focused on these particular queens' own audiences and the people that they might be able to bring in that would not be reached by traditional Disney advertising. Whether Disney will be willing to include this kind of queerness within their mainstream programming itself, it's another question entirely.
Before I continue, I also just want to say thank you to Rowan for collabing on this video. We also worked on another video for her channel called Disney and the AIDS Crisis that I highly recommend you check out. I'll be linking to it in the description. As Disney continues to embrace the LGBTQ community in more direct ways with new shows, movies, and events, it's clear that collaborations with performers such as Nina West will become more common. However, for me, whether or not these collaborations are successful depends on whether or not Disney can continue to commit being explicit and wholly supportive of the LGBTQ community. But the community doesn't necessarily need a stamp of approval to appreciate Disney. As Rowan and I have shown in this video, LGBTQ people have taken the hints provided by Disney movies and ran with them. One of the most beautiful things about drag is that by lip syncing, one can create an interpretation of a song that wasn't there to begin with. Like in musical theater, so many songs that are not necessarily intended for LGBTQ communities can become anthems and provide outlets that weren't originally there. I think that's a testament to the perseverance of queer people in cultures that don't accept them. If there isn't already a space for you, you might have to create it yourself. Between the queerness of certain characters and songs, the act of drag lip syncing to Disney is much more than just a performance. It's a way of realizing a fantasy. Because, truthfully, everybody deserves some magic. Salakadoola, menchikaboola, bibbidi boppidi boo. Put 'em together and what have you got? Bibbidi boppidi boo. Salakadoola, menchikaboola, bibbidi boppidi boo. It'll do magic, believe it or not, bippity boppity boo. Now salakadoola means oh menchikaboolaroo. But the thingamabob that just does the job is bippity boppity boo. Oh, salakadoola, menchikaboola, bippity boppity boo. Put 'em together and what have you got? Bippity boppity, bippity boppity, bippity boppity boo.